Welcome everyone to the Speaker Showcase featuring John Bowe. I am John Lurkwin, Marketing and Communications Director at Toastmasters International. It is my pleasure to moderate today's live Q&A session. To ask John a question, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Type in your question and hit send. We will do our best to get as many questions as possible. It is my pleasure to introduce John Bowe. John has written for the New Yorker magazine, the New York Times magazine, and many others. He has spent the last 8 years working on his new book, I Have Something to Say, Mastering the Art of Public Speaking in an Age of Disconnection. Published this month by Random House and is available at our convention store, which you can find through the convention app or on toastmasters.org. John's education session titled, I Have Something to Say, Mastering the Art of Public Speaking in an Age of Disconnection is available to watch on demand, and we are honored he's joining us live today. Please welcome John Bowe. John, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, John. It's fun to be here.
I'd like to kick us off with this comment, or this question. You say that speech training and rhetoric were once the most important, most highly emphasized subject of education. But now it seems as if it has disappeared, except for in Toastmasters. Why is that?
Well, you know, they invented public speaking and speech training back in ancient Greece when they invented democracy, because before that, nobody had to speak to crowds, and suddenly they did. And they immediately realized, wow, this is the quickest way to become rich and famous and powerful. If you can't speak, you cannot partake in any of the professions that require socializing and talking and persuading other people. So immediately it becomes the most popular subject, and it stays that way till about the 1600s. And a lot of what it was studying people's irrational side. How do you appeal to people with stuff besides rationality and facts and logic? Because as we all know, we're super opinionated and crazy. And so I think the reason for its decline was basically science and the printed page. It started to make less and less sense to study these weird speech things that weren't exactly logical. And so just decade by decade, century by century, people questioned it, and they thought, well, this is like teaching people to put lipstick on a pig. It's not a real science. It's not a real discipline. So it went from being the most important thing for about 2,000 years to being something that people found weird, except for Toastmasters and me.
You mentioned science and technology, the typewriter. I find that aspect fascinating. How do you think technology has impacted our ability to communicate?
Well, it's funny because I went into this with a total agenda, which you're not supposed to do as a journalist, but I was sure that technology has made us less able to speak to one another. And really, you know, social science is pretty bad most of the time. They don't do it the same way as they do hard science. They don't have enough subjects in the studies and stuff like that. But to the best of my ability, I was able to find out that really people who are interested in connecting with other people tend to use technology to further that. They find real people in real life through technology, and then they hang out with them and talk just like normal. But what did emerge, there was a Pew, it's a big, huge organization that does polls, and it's pretty trustworthy. They did something a couple years ago, and it turned out that something like 49% of people below the age of 35 use their devices to deliberately ignore people around them at least twice a week.
That's terrible.
It's terrible. It's awful. It's really awful. And I think this is slightly a separate question, but I do think that people having conversations, and especially political conversations online, it's easy to flame out. It's easy to be really critical and to just completely reject somebody's point of view. If I'm looking at you and you say something I disagree with, I can think, well, John looks like a reasonable, nice guy. So even if I don't like his position, he seems like an okay guy. But online, it's all or nothing. And I think that's really destructive to people's ability to connect and do the stuff that we learn how to do in Toastmasters.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. In your book and in your talk, you talk about the aspect of character, of credibility in communicating a message. You brought up social media. What are the cues and aspects that we tend to rely on to judge credibility, and have those disappeared in modern times, especially with social media?
I mean, that in a way is the most interesting question you could ask, and I could babble for hours and hours about it. You could write a whole separate book about it. So Aristotle, back in the day, when he wrote his book, the most authoritative treatise on rhetoric, which is to say speaking, communication, he said that we use three things to persuade each other. One is facts, one is emotions, and one is character. So character means what you see of my face. It's what anybody might know of me. Do I seem like an okay guy or a not trustworthy guy? And then another big part of that is just the consistency and the skill with which I explain my point. If I'm looking over there or my glasses are like this, I seem like I'm crazy and no one's going to listen to what I say. So in real life, those things are pretty easy to judge. And in social media, everything is fake, or it can be fake. Somebody might be real, somebody might be fake. And so I think that this issue of credibility, it's part of why we're in the mess we are politically. It's very hard to make consensus if you can't judge people's credibility. And so that goes back to my point, which is that it's a shame that we lost rhetoric and speech training, because whether it's social media or real life, we all need to be better at judging. Who am I talking to? Are they credible? Do I believe them?
You mentioned Aristotle, and you speak about him and tell us about how he's one of the highest authorities on rhetoric, although even he hated rhetoric for some reason. Can you explain that to us?
Sure. Okay. So they invented, I mean, all of these stories are apocryphal. We don't really have the facts about exactly when and how they invented public speaking. But supposedly it was invented by a lawyer in Sicily named Corax, because there was a rash of frivolous lawsuits and everybody was suing everybody. And con men realized that using the courts as a way to steal from people was a great way to do so. So if you were a fast talker, you could manipulate the legal system and take stuff away from people who had money. And so this lawyer invented a short pamphlet saying, here's how you speak in court, here's how you don't speak in court. And it was the first time anybody had invented anything telling you how to speak. And nobody had thought of that before. So suddenly people start studying it and studying the rules of good speech. And within a generation, it becomes the most studied thing in ancient Greece. So, of course, the sort of charlatans and the bad politicians and everybody are the first people to study it and get good at it. And they start coming up with these ways of having arguments and discourse that manipulate everybody, but it's dazzling and it's almost like a magic show. And so Plato, among other people, starts writing these pamphlets saying, this rhetoric stuff is terrible. It's leading Greece into the gutter. It's the worst thing ever invented. Why would anyone who is a good person speaking the truth need to learn how to fancy that up and make it better? And so for a while, some people agreed with him. They said, yeah, this rhetoric stuff is leading Greece into the toilet. And then Aristotle, who agreed with him at first, came along and realized, well, even if we hate it, we need to be good at it because everyone else is using it. And in a world of rhetoric, the good people need it to triumph over the bad people. And he says two great quotes. One is, you need rhetoric because there are plenty of people who are immune to facts and rationality. And we all know that, right? There are people in our lives who we're frustrated and we're saying, but don't you see the facts? Don't you see the facts? And the truth is, for a lot of people, they don't.
You make me think of Neil deGrasse Tyson. And I think of a scientist trying to communicating a message to the public. And then here comes someone as charismatic as Neil deGrasse Tyson, essentially playing the game, tugging at our emotional strings, speaking so eloquently, no matter what your expertise is.
Perfect example, right? If you saw the facts of something on the page, you may or may not agree with them, but it takes a charismatic explainer or somebody, quote unquote, sympathetic. All of those are different ways of talking about credibility. And that's what Aristotle studied to death. And it is as rigorous as science. What is credibility? How do we address that?
In your book, you talk about how learning to speak in public has nothing to do with our emotions and that we should think of it purely as an artistic skill like cooking. Can you explain this a little bit more?
that was one of the most fascinating things to me. Now, if you were to Google public speaking, what do I do to learn how to do it? It's all about getting over your anxiety, learning how to be confident. You know, all of the tips that you hear outside of Toastmasters, like imagine the audience naked, or do these deep breathing exercises, or power poses, which supposedly trigger chemicals, which then, you know, reduce your cortisol levels and blah, 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 and beta blockers, all of these things. Imagine if you applied those to flying a plane. Okay, you might have some anxiety about flying a plane for your first time, but getting over your anxiety won't teach you how to operate the levers of the airplane. And so if you view speech, there are these levers, there are these marks that I need to hit. If I'm going to speak to you and I have some data that I want to give you, if I forget to say, hi, John, good morning, how are you doing? That makes me seem slightly cold and weird. If I speak in a language you don't understand, or I speak too quickly, or I don't organize myself very well, you don't understand it, you don't believe me. So learning all of these things has nothing to do with my anxiety or confidence or charisma. And so there's this, you know, it's a little fuzzy, but there is a formula for how to connect with other people. So my point is, focus on other people, focus on other people, focus on other people. And you may still be you still may be anxious, but you'll connect better, and then soon your anxiety will go away. So that's like an effect, it's not a cause.
Well, here's a question from the audience about anxiety and nervousness. This is from Lisa Marie Gellis. She comments on your speaking style. She says, I love how personable you are and how relaxed and authentic you appear to be. How do you get there? How do you prepare yourself for a presentation and deal with those nerves?
I mean, part of that is personality. I'm just kind of a screw up, and I could not be very formal and pristine and have some really cold, austere, authoritative persona, even if I tried. But for preparing, you know, like especially if it's a speech, like the educational speech, I have to work like crazy for that. If I have a lot of information to get out there, for me, the task of organizing it and just thinking through how do I do this? How do I do this? I have to work incredibly hard even to do an okay job. And the good news is, like before, when I used to do speeches, I would feel terrible afterwards because I would not have said what I wanted to say. And now I might not do a perfect job ever, but I do end up saying what I want to say. But all of that is planning.
How often do you practice? And how much do you practice prior to a presentation?
I never have enough time to practice as much as I would like to practice. Usually I spend too much time writing the speech and not enough time delivering it and saying it out loud. I feel like I still have a lot of delivery issues in terms of just speaking clearly and knowing where to look. And now in this age of Zoom, there's always some last minute technical problem. You can see the light reflecting in my glasses. Well, this summer, we've had a lot of Zoom meetings, and I'm not a lighting guy. And the number of hours that I have spent trying to be a lighting guy when I'm just a bad lighting guy, I'd rather, you know, spend my time preparing the speech and learning to enunciate.
Well, you're always your own biggest critic, and you'll notice everything that goes wrong that the audience never notices.
That's true. That is true. But, you know, the really, really good thing that I learned from Toastmasters and from studying public speaking is just in the past, I used to wing it, and I thought that winging it was what an authentic person does. And then I would never say my authentic thoughts, and I would feel incredibly inauthentic and losery afterwards. And just like I wasted people's time by not saying what they had come to hear me say. And by preparing, I really do end up saying what I wanted to say. And that's pretty brilliant. But how long does it take? Endless.
Never enough time. We have another question about credibility. How important is attire and appearance to portraying a level of credibility?
Well, I wish that they weren't important because I don't like to dress up and I don't like to think about clothes or haircuts or any of that stuff. Unfortunately, everyone else does. Aristotle says something great, which is that if you don't do everything in the way that your audience thinks is appropriate, they won't believe you even when you're telling the truth. So that means if your gestures are weird, if you keep saying, I caught a fish that was 1 meter long, and people notice, well, that's not a meter, and you keep doing something like that, you might be telling the truth, but they'll think you're weird. And I think the same goes for clothing. You know, I mean, I've heard you should always dress like your audience or maybe slightly better, just to show some respect. And that's something that I'm just having to accept. That's the way it is.
I know what you mean. It's this sort of artificial invention among society, among humans. And there's a perception behind how you're dressed, and then we make a lot of assumptions about it.
You know, one of the things I always liked about being a writer was that I could wear whatever I wanted, and no one could ever judge it. If you're a writer, you can kind of get away with it. And if you're a public speaker, suddenly you can't, even if you're a public speaker speaking about something that you wrote.
And now the world's put you on camera in your career, so.
That's what I mean. I can't get away with it anymore.
Yeah. There's a question here about teaching rhetoric in modern times and in education. Do you have an opinion on when that should be taught in school? Is there a certain age or certain topics that should be covered to teach rhetoric?
I have mixed opinions, and I'm not really educated enough yet about how education works and how schools would practically be able to teach it. But I have been speaking lately with literally dozens of educators. And I feel like, I mean, it's a long answer. I'll try to make it short, but I think you could start, I think, in elementary school with some very, very simple exercises. You know, they say, you know, that 3/4 of people in America and the rest of the world have speech anxiety. So the Greeks had this great curriculum, this great speech training curriculum that began with younger kids and had them simply stand in front of their class and read a very, very, very short story. And so anybody can do that. And once they do that, they could say, great, now you're part of the curriculum, and you can't just say, oh, I have speech anxiety, I can't participate. And you would go up this escalating ladder of cognitive and speech exercises that made you get better and better at it. I don't think there's such a thing as too young for it. I spoke with someone the other day at a school here in New York called the Browning School, and they have the most incredible speech training courses built into every grade, beginning in sounded like second grade or first grade.
Yeah, I feel like in the 90s there became an emphasis on teaching self-esteem and presentation skills at a very young age. It was probably born out of a correlation between later life success and self-esteem, and correlation causation kind of thing.
They've done all of these studies, and you know, cognitive control is the one thing that correlates with success as an adult. And by success, they don't just mean money, they mean divorce and suicide and depression rates and all of these really serious things that people grapple with. And so right in the middle of what you're talking about, which they call social emotional education, public speaking and speech training is just the thing that keeps it from being kind of airy-fairy and touchy-feely and keeps it really, really real and connected.
Speaking of modern times, especially this year, we find ourselves in front of a computer screen, in front of a camera more than ever. We're in virtual meetings. This is a question from Samir. This question is about how do you continue to be lively? How do you avoid Zoom fatigue? Do you experience Zoom fatigue?
I mean, I'm lucky because my Zoom, the number of hours per day and week that I'm spending on Zoom goes up and down. But especially at the beginning of the pandemic, I found it exhausting. And now I have learned, first of all, to offload some of those meetings and say, you know what, let's just do this by phone. And I couldn't even tell you exactly why phone is so much easier, but it is. So if I can get rid of a third of my Zoom meetings or half of my Zoom meetings and do them by phone, that's helpful. And another thing is also just trying to be tougher about the orchestration of the Zoom meeting, show up on time. If you have it's just like a speech, right? I mean, in Toastmasters, they teach us to memorize the intro and the conclusion to our speech. And there's something about It's just one of these structural public speaking rules. Make the beginning crisp and make the ending crisp, because if the end of a meeting is everybody just kind of wandering on, say, well, okay, so yeah, it leaves you with bad, I don't want to say bad energy, but just unclear energy. It takes away energy. And I think if the goal is for everyone to feel clear and connected, you got to really take advantage of every little trick to make these Zoom meetings better. I mean, even the lighting and the sound. I've gotten my own lights and mic at home, which I never wanted to do and never thought I would do. But if I can make myself more clear to you and you can do that to me, I'm going to work less to get you. So I think it's just like public, it is exactly, it's not a technical problem, it's a public speaking problem. So I feel like we have to think at every turn, how can I exploit this better, connect better, and demand that other people do the same thing?
With less of an emphasis in modern times on rhetoric and public speaking than what we've had in the past as humans, do you see an increase in disparity in our population, an increase in inequality, where some types of people, for whatever reason, continue to take advantage and benefit from their public speaking skills and communication skills while we're leaving others behind?
It's an interesting question. A long time ago, I think it was Plato who said that rhetoric is the skill that allows us to control other people. And I don't think, and even though he hated rhetoric at the beginning, he eventually came around. And so I think he wasn't saying that in a negative way. But I think it's pretty obvious to me, and especially going forward into the future, you'll have the kinds of people who are allowed to be around real people. Mm-hmm. And you already see this in managerial class. And then you'll see the people who are on their devices. But look around the higher management at any big company, all of them know how to deal with people. Mm-hmm. They may have started off being engineering types or people looking at a device a lot, but after a while, they're spending less and less time each day looking at a device. To me, that tells me that, you know, the ability to speak to people is still, it absolutely correlates with rising through the ranks. I'm not sure if that answers the question well enough.
I think it did. You brought up devices. You started off your talk with a comment on devices. Personally, I hate, you can't see it, I'm holding up my cell phone. I hate this thing. It drives my life and it helps me stay connected, which I love. But it certainly has had an impact on my quality of life. I feel like I need to be very explicit with how I interact with this thing that's very important to me. How do you feel that this has impacted society? Do you have any advice for people with how to interact with devices?
I have this completely false imagined version of how French people control devices. I don't know why I did this, but I just imagine that when they have family dinner, there are no devices. And when it's the weekend, they say like, well, I am not available. And I always aspire to be like that, and I never quite make it. But I do think having these no-fly zones, these parts of the day where you aren't looking at your device, where you're not available, we're all dead unless we can figure out some kind of rule. So whether it's by person or by family or by country or just all of us at the same time, we just sort of need to say, you know what, I'm not available after 6:30 and I'm not available till 7 o'clock the next morning or 9 o'clock the next morning, whatever. It's so distracting, especially as a writer. You can't have your attention torn in 8 different directions like that all the time. It's a disaster.
And then there's that fear of missing out. I have to check, I have to see what else is going on. But so often, I mean, your life is right in front of you.
I think it does inculcate a kind of loneliness. Everybody wants that dopamine hit that you get with every new message. And every little tinkle says, maybe you're not missing out. Maybe this is the answer. Maybe this is the thing you've been waiting for. And it just keeps you on tenterhooks in a way that, I mean, I'm like the 10,000th person to say it, but it's just not healthy. And it does, I do think that keeps us, it robs us from our ability to focus on the here and now. Mm-hmm. I'll never forget once in New York, a friend called me out to dinner late for some spontaneous dinner with a bunch of friends. And I was feeling kind of sick and I had wanted to stay home and just get over the cold or whatever was coming on. But he kept persisting, and so I went out, and everybody at the table was looking at their phone during the meal.
Yep.
And I've gotten pretty ornery. If I go out and I meet with people in real life and they check their phone, I'll tell them, I didn't come to meet you to watch you look at your phone.
I've stopped bringing it out with me. If I'm out with my partner and we're out to dinner, I'll leave it at home or in the car at most, and it helps me not even think about it.
I think it's also a profound sign of respect. I think, what does it tell you if we're in the middle of a talk and I'm doing this? It just says this is more important than you.
Right.
And nobody likes that.
Speaking of showing the love, you talk a lot about that rhetoric is about the audience, and the audience is there to find happiness. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Okay, everything smart that I will ever say about this comes from my man Aristotle. So Aristotle said a couple of great things. One was the audience is the beginning and the end of public speaking. And it just means that you are there for them. Everything you do, every choice you make about what to wear, what to say, how to organize it, every part of it is you are thinking of them. So I thought about this for years, and I kept unpacking it and bringing the meaning out of it. And I realized that at the heart of public speaking, like, okay, for example, look at I think it's the #1 TED Talk of all time that Sir Edward Robinson, and he's talking about education, how we need to make education better to serve kids. Well, in his speech, which is about 20 minutes, really about 2 minutes is about his subject. And the rest is him being amiable and telling these stories. I mean, they're mildly pertinent to his subject, but you realize that speeches are they're very poor delivery systems for information. Information is not the key part of a speech. And ultimately, the key part of the speech is just showing that I have my act together and I respect you enough to be talking to you. I think they really have with stand-up comedy and dance and other art forms than they do with just delivering information. The whole point of a speech is to show that you respect your audience.
I love that message. Well, John, we knew this time was going to go quick, and unfortunately we're out of time. I really enjoyed this, and I know our audience did too. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us.
Great, thank you guys too, and good luck with the rest of the convention and everything else.
Please, if you haven't yet, please check out John's talk, education session through the Toastmasters app or through our website. And also, please check out his book, I Have Something to Say, Mastering the Art of Public Speaking in an Age of Disconnection. And you can find it at toastmasters.org. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John.
All right. Thank you again, Sean and everyone else. Bye.